glad after 23 hours of flying, I did not have to go before the lunch break. so I'm really glad to be here. I'm very excited to be here. I came from New York City, as the moderator said, and I'm really excited to spend the next 20 minutes just talking with you all about this idea that I call social elevation through innovation and democratization of knowledge. And I promise that's just a fancy title. It's going to make a lot more sense by the end of this presentation. So just a little bit about me. I am an associate director of marketing at an artificial intelligence company. We're actually based out of London, but we have an office in New York as well. And I teach marketing management at universities in New York. So let's get started. So just to tell a little bit of a story, when I was a kid, probably 10 years old or so, living in a pretty underserved neighborhood in New York City, I gave a speech to my grade school graduating class. My mom used to recite this quote to me, and it stuck with me, and I decided to share it with my students, my fellow students, during the speech. So the quote said, "The more you read, the more you know. The more you know, the smarter you grow. The smarter you grow, the stronger your voice when speaking your mind or making your choice." So I thought it was so interesting because I realized through my childhood and my adolescence just how much the attainment of knowledge mattered so much. The access to data, for example, showed me just how easily so many people became a statistic, right? The access to information showed me the systems that I needed to navigate to avoid falling into those traps. And then the access to knowledge, when that data became information, that information became knowledge, my path forward just became so much clearer. So I think about that even to this day. And so now as a working professional in corporate America and as an educator as well in the higher education system in the United States, I'm able to scale this concept to the highest level. As a marketing professional, I'm able to see so many opportunities for cross-pollination between business, culture, and society. So I look at society today and I see the ways that it's evolved, right? Both by design, but also just by accident sometimes. And I think about how the root of that remains in the access to data, and that data turning into information, turning into knowledge, and creating a much clearer path forward for all of us. So I believe that modern organizations need to rethink their purpose, right? The idea that they exist merely for profit, I think is archaic. Because beyond business as usual, as we call it, they are members of society and contributors to our collective culture. Modern organizations can't take for granted that the data, information, knowledge that they have these days can produce widespread change across society as we know it. I think the overwhelming majority of data remains unstructured and untapped. And as leaders in the knowledge management field, you guys know this better than everybody. I'm just preaching to the choir. But my particular curiosity lies in the possibilities and the what ifs. So think about this. What if society knew what organizations know? What if the innovative and disruptive environments of business have created a new role for modern organizations? What if all of the knowledge that keeps the corporate lights on has multifaceted benefits that can go beyond the walls of business and into the fabric of culture and society? Organizations know a lot. Now I'm in the tech industry, we know a hell of a lot, sometimes more than governments. And I believe that with this sort of privilege comes a certain responsibility to participate in the democratization of what we've come to know. I truly believe that our future, our collective future, depends on that. So we'll take a step back and kind of look at this through three high-level concepts. One, data points to the future. Two, innovation for elevation, and three, the knowledge ecosystem. So with the first one here, data points to the future, it's kind of a play on words that I made up, but I briefly wanted to discuss how data becomes knowledge. And a lot of you are very familiar with this process. You might be familiar with the knowledge value chain framework. But I think the most important thing to think about is not only the framework itself, but paying attention to what you get sort of at that top line and what you do with what you get at the bottom line, right? So the key is, and you can literally read it as it is on the slide, you acquire data, you process information, you analyze knowledge, you communicate intelligence, you apply decisions, you formulate actions, and you implement value. So if you break this down a little bit, the acquisition of data used to be so hard, right? And now data science is a whole field on its own because there are so many technological advancements that have allowed organizations to get from that point of data to that point of knowledge much faster and much easier, right? So these are just some of the ways that companies are acquiring data in the modern world. Your web browsing, your social media activity, online advertising, how you use Wi-Fi, your spending habits, trackers and sensors that are in your devices. Machine learning algorithms have and other artificial intelligence capabilities as well, but they've sort of made organizations more powerful in speeding up the collection and the analysis of wide sets of data. So today, companies know what you search for, they know your age and your gender, they know your socioeconomic status, they know what media you like, they know the brands that you like, they know everything that you consume, they know where you travel, right? They know your health issues, they know your financial failures, they can predict when you're going to be in the job market, they can predict your likelihood to commit crimes. So there's a lot of knowledge there. And it's kind of a scary amount, right? Like they know so much about us, sometimes I think oftentimes more than we know about ourselves. But the key, if you go back to this knowledge value chain framework, the key is to evaluate how that data turns into knowledge, but most importantly, how it's implemented. And that's where I think the real value lies. So if you think about it this way, employees at organizations are likely to collect information and share that across the organization in ways that they see fit. So it's usually information that's beneficial to their immediate role, the role of their team, their department, perhaps the company as a whole if they're able to scale up their role to that high sort of level. But what I think about is kind of the bigger picture. I think about what about the knowledge that isn't seemingly beneficial in those immediate circles, right? What about the knowledge that raises a red flag for social, political, or cultural issues? What if that could be democratized for some sort of social use? So imagine if we can more easily get information and knowledge from different sectors and sort of bring us together to get a point of clarity on the direction that we need to take as a society. I think so much of today's knowledge is critical to tomorrow's success, and we can't take this for granted because, as I mentioned before, because of the speed by which we can get from data to knowledge, we have to consider areas where it can really have some important value for us as a society. So these are just some of the many big issues we face in the world today, right? And I'm speaking from the perspective of living in the United States, but I'm pretty sure these issues span globally. So just starting in order, we have issues around the access to affordable housing due to gentrification, right? And neighborhoods are being completely transformed to benefit the upper middle class and the rich. And I think about companies like Starbucks, who have so much knowledge when it comes to the housing market and to gentrification. That knowledge can help us with coming up with ways to protect people from being displaced. Environmental protection is one of the biggest issues that I think faces our generation today. And landfill waste and carbon emissions and all of these things are causing so much damage that we're not going to be able to reverse. There's a company called The Real Real. It's actually a very successful online luxury consignment business. So they pretty much just buy old luxury goods from people and they try to resell them on this online marketplace. And companies like that have so much knowledge when it comes to landfill waste, believe it or not. 85% of unwanted clothes actually ends up in landfills. And a lot of that ends up being burned. And that's speeding up the rate of climate change. Last year it was estimated that 34% of the American workforce is actually sort of in the gig economy, they're freelancers, right? And that number is actually expected to go up to 43% by 2020. So I think about companies like Uber and the ways that they can really share their knowledge of the gig economy and really create some exposure about gender pay gaps and things like that. And I think that can have so much value when it comes to our policy landscape, not so much political, but policy landscape, to look at the ways that we can close the gap of family incomes. I think this last one is a little touchy, but we have a lot of issues around the access to guns and mental illnesses, with people who are not able to function properly, and so they take out their frustrations through violence. And I think about companies like Facebook, who are monitoring social behaviors, they're monitoring digital communities, and they have so much knowledge that we could use to help us kind of navigate this world of mental illness and depression. And these are just some examples, but I think they're very, very powerful ones. So if we move on to the second concept, innovation for elevation, and again, I'm playing with my words here, this time with a little bit of a rhyme. But here's where I see a lot of opportunity. I think the very fact that this image is divided is the problem, right? In society, particularly democratic and capitalistic societies, it is thought that the private sector is supposed to be concerned with innovation and capital gains, right? That leaves the public sector to be more concerned with social elevation and protection. And I think when you think of things in that sort of binary construct, you create a lot of inefficiencies, and it isolates how we approach both sides of this equation. So I think with the rise of tech advancements, we've seen many instances where there's a shift in power between public and private. And I think the private sector, especially in tech, they react so quickly to things that are happening in the public sector. And then in the public sector, they are getting all this intel about social behaviors and kind of the changing landscape of humanity because of the private sector. So I think operating in these silos is just not really going to serve us very well moving down the line. I think it should look a little bit more like this. I think we need to look at ways that we can unleash knowledge, right, to flow properly between public and private. To me, I ask this question all the time working in the tech industry: why are we innovating if we're not also seeking to elevate, if we're not also seeking to get society to a point that we can be prouder of? So I think knowledge workers and organizations can learn a lot from this sort of fundamental model of scientific discovery, and I think most of you might be familiar with this. It demonstrates how scientists go from mere observations to experiments to then developing theories. And that just leads to more observations and more experiments and more theories. And I think the more you can kind of look, if you think about the knowledge value chain we spoke about earlier, the more you can kind of look at these things as a set of interconnected links, the more you realize that everything is connected, right? And it should bring us to the point of thinking more about the application of all of this, like I said at the beginning of this presentation. So that flows right into this third concept, the knowledge ecosystem. So let's imagine a world where individuals, universities, businesses, and governments can still operate within their sort of unique missions, but they can empower each other. They can very quickly complete the needs of each other. So a few years ago, during my graduate studies of information and knowledge strategy at Columbia University, I worked with an artificial intelligence company. It's very different than the one that I work for now. This company focused a lot on automating pretty much every touch point of customer service through a cognitive agent. So you can think of a much more advanced like Siri or Alexa. And I think about the wealth of knowledge that that company has, and it's unbelievable. And I really thought, how can we put this knowledge into action, right? So after many conversations with some very large management consulting companies like McKinsey, Accenture, Gartner, it became very clear to me that the best way to mobilize knowledge was through this bridging of the public and private sectors. 80% of the world's data is unstructured, untapped. We all know this, right? And it's waiting to be analyzed. And I think if anybody is going to be capable of even making a small dent into that, it's going to be modern organizations that live in this tech-driven world. So just to summarize, modern organizations need to recognize the value their knowledge has to tackle big social issues like mental health, environmental protection, and gender and economic inequalities, among many other issues. The current distinction between corporations and government, where one is for profit and the other is for people, is ineffective and damaging. As innovations transform the ways we live, work, and thrive, we must consider social responsibility and implications for the future by finding new applications for organizational knowledge. And lastly, with the privilege of having fast access and analysis of data comes the responsibility to democratize knowledge that can make a positive difference and create a brighter path forward for humanity. Thank you so very much.